The coffin was heavy. 6 pallbearers struggled with the weight as they carried it up the steps of Mount Olivet Baptist Church on a cold November morning in 1955. Inside the mahogany casket, according to the death certificate, lay the body of James Washington, age 67, who died peacefully in his sleep 3 days earlier. The funeral service was scheduled for 2 p.m. The burial would follow at Woodlawn Cemetery, but James Washington wasn't dead. And what was really inside that coffin would change the balance of power in Harlem forever. Bumpy Johnson stood at the back of the church, dressed in his finest black suit, his face a mask of solemn respect. To anyone watching, he appeared to be just another mourner paying his respects to a community elder. But Bumpy's eyes weren't focused on the casket or the grieving family. They were watching the street through the church windows, counting the unmarked cars that had been circling the block for the past hour. Federal agents, at least 12 of them, maybe more. They'd been following the funeral procession since it left the funeral home on 125th Street, maintaining a careful distance, but never losing sight of the hearse. Because the FBI suspected that this funeral was more than it appeared to be. They were right. They just didn't understand how right they were. 3 weeks earlier, Bumpy had received information that would have destroyed most men's faith in humanity. The Italian families weren't content with controlling the docks, the unions, and the gambling operations. They were planning to flood Harlem with heroin, pure, cheap, devastating heroin that would turn his neighborhood into a graveyard of addiction and despair, and they were using a man Bumpy had once trusted to make it happen. Vincent the Fish Torrino had been running a small operation out of Brooklyn for 2 years, importing heroin from Sicily and distributing it through a network of street dealers. Small-time stuff, mostly serving white customers in Manhattan. But the Genovese family had bigger plans for Vincent's product. They wanted to expand into Harlem, where poverty and frustration made people desperate enough to try anything that promised escape. The plan was simple and evil in its efficiency. Flood the community with cheap drugs, let addiction take hold, then raise the prices once people were hooked, create a captive market that would generate millions in profit while destroying lives, families, and the social fabric that held the neighborhood together. It was genocide disguised as business. But Vincent had made a crucial mistake. He'd tried to recruit one of Bumpy's policy runners, a young man named Eugene Mouse Patterson, to help distribute the heroin. Mouse had pretended to be interested while gathering intelligence on the operation. Within a week, Bumpy knew everything: the supply routes, the distribution network, the timeline, and most importantly, the location where Vincent stored his inventory. A warehouse in Red Hook, Brooklyn, converted from an old fish processing plant, which explained Vincent's nickname. The building was guarded but not heavily fortified. Vincent felt safe because his operation was small enough to avoid federal attention, and his connections with the Genovese family provided protection from rival criminals. He'd never considered that someone might target him for ideological reasons rather than profit. Bumpy had spent 2 weeks planning the heist, not to steal the drugs for resale, but to steal them for destruction. Because Bumpy Johnson understood something that the Italian families never grasped. You don't get rich by poisoning your own community. You get rich by protecting it, nurturing it, helping it prosper. Heroin was an attack on everything Bumpy had spent 20 years building. The raid itself had been surgical in its precision. Bumpy brought 4 men: Illinois Gordon, his most trusted lieutenant; Raymond Quick Lewis, a former boxer with hands like sledgehammers; Willie Fish Jackson, an expert with locks and alarms; and Jerome Williams, the youngest and fastest, perfect for keeping watch. They struck at 3 a.m. when the guards were tired and the neighborhood was asleep. Vincent kept the heroin in a temperature-controlled room in the basement, packaged in waterproof containers and ready for distribution. 47 kilograms of pure heroin worth approximately $2 million on the street. Enough poison to hook thousands of people, destroy hundreds of families, turn Harlem into a wasteland of addiction and crime. Bumpy and his crew loaded everything into their truck and vanished into the night. By the time Vincent's men discovered the theft the next morning, the heroin was already hidden in a location where no one would think to look for it. Inside a coffin in the basement preparation room of Harlem's most respected funeral home. Marcus Freeman had been the director of Freeman & Sons Funeral Home for 30 years. His family had been burying Harlem's dead since 1923, treating every departed soul with dignity regardless of their station in life. Marcus understood the importance of discretion, the value of trust, and the necessity of sometimes helping the living as much as the dead. When Bumpy approached him with an unusual request, Marcus listened carefully. Bumpy explained the situation without revealing too many details. Italian mobsters were planning to poison the community. Bumpy had intercepted their weapons, but needed a way to destroy them publicly, dramatically, in a manner that would send an unmistakable message. Could Marcus help? The plan they devised was both brilliant and deeply symbolic. They would stage a funeral for James Washington, a retired postal worker who'd agreed to participate in exchange for $5,000, and the promise that his real funeral, when the time came, would be the finest Harlem had ever seen. James would hide in the basement while his body was buried. The coffin would contain the heroin, along with enough accelerant to ensure complete destruction. For 3 days, the charade played out perfectly. James Washington lay in state in a closed casket, accepting condolences from neighbors who genuinely mourned the loss of a good man. The heroin remained hidden beneath the false bottom of the coffin, invisible to the federal agents who'd been monitoring the funeral home as part of their investigation into organized crime activities in Harlem. The FBI's presence wasn't unexpected. They'd been tracking unusual activity in the neighborhood for weeks, trying to understand why several known criminals had been meeting with funeral directors, church officials, and community leaders. They suspected some kind of money laundering operation, or perhaps a plan to smuggle contraband through religious institutions. They were both right and completely wrong. On the morning of the funeral, Bumpy made his final preparations. He'd already sent word through the underground network that connected every policy runner, numbers banker, and street hustler in Harlem. Something important was going to happen at Mount Olivet Baptist Church, something that would affect everyone who lived north of 110th Street. Be there, bear witness, remember what you see. The church filled quickly, not just with mourners for James Washington, but with representatives from every corner of Harlem's criminal and legitimate communities. Policy bankers sat next to shop owners. Numbers runners shared pews with church deacons. Prostitutes and school teachers, hustlers and housewives, all united by the understanding that Bumpy Johnson was about to make a statement that would define the neighborhood's future. Vincent Torrino was there too, though he tried to remain inconspicuous near the back of the church. He'd spent 3 days trying to figure out who'd stolen his heroin, offering a $50,000 reward for information leading to its recovery. The theft had cost him more than money. It had cost him credibility with the Genovese family. If he couldn't recover the drugs or identify the thieves, his life expectancy would be measured in days rather than years. As the pallbearers carried the coffin down the church aisle, Bumpy watched Vincent's face carefully. The Italian's eyes were scanning the congregation, looking for any sign of guilt or knowledge about his missing inventory. He had no idea that the very thing he was searching for was passing within arm's reach, hidden beneath the ornate mahogany that symbolized Harlem's respect for its departed. The service itself was beautiful and heartbreaking. Reverend Clayton Powell Jr. delivered a eulogy that celebrated James Washington's life while speaking in coded language about the threats facing the community. He talked about wolves in sheep's clothing, about poison disguised as medicine, about the importance of protecting the vulnerable from those who would exploit their desperation. The congregation understood. This wasn't just a funeral service. It was a declaration of war against anyone who would bring drugs into their neighborhood. It was a commitment to protect their children, their families, their future from the kind of destruction they'd seen consume other communities. It was Bumpy Johnson's way of saying that Harlem would not go quietly into the darkness of addiction and despair. After the service, the funeral procession wound its way through the streets of Harlem, past the Apollo Theater, past Small's Paradise, past all the landmarks that defined the community's cultural and social identity. Federal agents followed at a respectful distance, still trying to understand what kind of criminal enterprise they were investigating. At Woodlawn Cemetery, the assembled mourners gathered around the gravesite as Reverend Powell offered final prayers for James Washington's soul. The coffin was lowered into the ground with appropriate solemnity. Dirt was shoveled over the mahogany surface. Flowers were placed on the fresh grave. To all appearances, James Washington had been laid to rest with dignity and respect. But as the crowd began to disperse, Bumpy Johnson remained behind. He waited until the federal agents had driven away, until the other mourners had returned to their cars, until only his closest associates remained in the cemetery. Then he gave a signal that had been planned for weeks. Illinois Gordon and Raymond Lewis had already positioned themselves near the groundskeeper's shed, where they'd hidden shovels and other equipment earlier that morning. Working quickly but carefully, they began to exhume the coffin they'd just buried. It took 20 minutes to unearth the casket and another 10 minutes to extract the hidden heroin from the secret compartment. What happened next became the stuff of legend. Bumpy Johnson, standing beside an open grave in the middle of Harlem's most prestigious cemetery, personally set fire to $2 million worth of heroin. The pure white powder burned with an almost supernatural intensity, creating clouds of acrid smoke that rose toward the sky like incense from some ancient sacrifice. As the drugs burned, Bumpy spoke to the small group of witnesses who'd remained behind. His voice was calm, measured, carrying the weight of absolute conviction. He talked about responsibility, about protecting the community, about the difference between getting rich and getting wealthy. Rich was about money, wealth was about legacy, and no amount of money was worth destroying the place you called home. The burning lasted almost an hour. $2 million worth of heroin reduced to ash and memory. When it was finished, Bumpy scattered the ashes over the grave, mixing the remains of Vincent's empire with the symbolic burial of James Washington. Then they refilled the grave, replaced the flowers, and restored the site to its appearance of peaceful rest. James Washington emerged from hiding 2 days later, officially recovering from a case of mistaken identity at the hospital. The death certificate was quietly amended. The funeral home's records were discreetly corrected. Life returned to normal, except for the message that now circulated through every criminal network from Brooklyn to the Bronx. Bumpy Johnson had declared war on drug dealers, not to take over their business, but to eliminate it entirely from his territory. Anyone who brought heroin into Harlem would face the same fate as Vincent's shipment: complete and total destruction. Vincent Torrino understood the message clearly. Within a week, he'd relocated his operation to Philadelphia, telling his Genovese contacts that the New York market wasn't profitable enough to justify the security risks. He lived another 12 years before dying of natural causes, never again attempting to distribute drugs in any neighborhood where Bumpy Johnson held influence. The Italian families got the message too. They abandoned their plans to expand into Harlem, focusing instead on other markets where the local leadership was more amenable to negotiation. The heroin epidemic that devastated other urban communities in the late 1950s and early 1960s largely bypassed Harlem, not because of law enforcement or government intervention, but because one man had decided to protect his neighborhood regardless of the cost. Federal agents never solved the mystery of the unusual funeral. Their surveillance reports noted suspicious activity, but couldn't identify any specific criminal behavior. The case file was eventually closed due to lack of evidence, though several agents remained convinced that they'd witnessed something significant without understanding what it was. Years later, when heroin did finally arrive in Harlem during the chaos following Bumpy's death, old-timers would remember the funeral of James Washington. They'd tell younger generations about the day Bumpy Johnson buried $2 million worth of drugs rather than profit from them. They'd explain how real power wasn't about controlling people, but about protecting them. The story became a symbol of everything Bumpy Johnson represented: intelligence over violence, community over profit, long-term thinking over immediate gratification. It demonstrated that sometimes the most radical act isn't taking something but destroying it, especially when that something threatens everything you've worked to build. November 1955, the day a coffin walked into Harlem carrying death and walked out leaving life. The day Bumpy Johnson proved that some things are more valuable than money. The day a funeral became a celebration, a burial became a resurrection, and a neighborhood learned that sometimes the most important thing you can do with power is refuse to use it for profit. James Washington lived another 13 years, dying peacefully in his sleep at age 80. His real funeral was indeed the finest Harlem had ever seen, attended by hundreds of people who remembered his sacrifice and his courage. He was buried in the same plot where the heroin had been destroyed, and his headstone carried an inscription that puzzled visitors who didn't know the story: "He died so others could live." That's what Bumpy Johnson understood that his enemies never did. True power isn't about what you can take, it's about what you're willing to give up. And on that cold November morning in 1955, he gave up $2 million in profit to purchase something infinitely more valuable: the soul of his community.